Good afternoon, everyone. I won't be speaking in French, sorry, it's not good enough. And can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So thank you to the organizers of the workshop and to Agropolis Fondation and CIRAD for inviting me here. Unfortunately, my colleague Sheila also wanted to come, but she couldn't come because of passport problems. But I'm very grateful to be here, and it's great to be in a live event, first time for 2 years, so this is quite a pleasure, and I hope I can retain my voice. It's quite, daunting suddenly to be in front of people instead of a screen, so this is quite exciting. Today I just wanted to give a sort of summary of the impacts of pesticides on the environment. As we know, there's a huge impact on the environment, and I can't go into all the details. I only have 15 to 20 minutes, and I really wanted to just bring out some of the latest research to highlight some of the findings that have come about recently on the impacts of pesticides on biodiversity and the environment. Okay, so I just wanted to start with an introduction on how I became aware of pesticide impacts on the environment. And this began, obviously I'd learnt about it in university, but when I first had that real-world experience of the negative impact of pesticides was when I visited Ecuador in 2013 while working for the International Rice Research Institute. And I was visiting Ecuador to help the government tackle a problem of golden apple snails in rice. And this was an invasive pest that only was introduced to the country in 2005, but over an 8-year period, it spread across 80% of the rice-growing area and became a huge problem, and farmers didn't really know how to deal with it. And the most common way they dealt with this pest was the use of pesticides. And unfortunately, one of the pesticides they used was a broad-spectrum insecticide, an organochlorine called endosulfan. This is banned across Europe and in many countries. It is now banned in Ecuador, but at that time it was commonly used. And it was quite apparent the effects of this pesticide when I went to visit the fields. There was very little life in the rice fields, an aquatic system where there was no fish, no invertebrates in the water, and then you saw dead vertebrates like amphibians here and birds around the field. And then you could also see the scattered pesticide bottles around. So this was a real clear, direct consequence of pesticide use in the environment. Then a colleague of mine from IRI, Finbar Horgan, went to Ecuador a year after and conducted a survey to interview farmers about how they managed this pest problem and what other pests were they encountering in their rice fields. And he found that of all the farmers that applied metaldehyde, a molluscicide, to control golden apple snails, 82% of those farmers also reported problems of other pests such as planthopper and rice hoya blanca virus. He also looked at those who applied multiple pesticides to control this pest, and those who used metaldehyde, endosulfan, and neonicotinoids all had problems with other pests. And of the farmers that didn't apply any pesticide to control golden apple snails, only 24% of those reported problems with these other pests. So this implied that the application of pesticide to control one pest was leading to problems with others. So I will come back to this later, but this is really just to give an overview of the indirect and direct effects of pesticides on the environment. And in this talk, I'll try and highlight some of those key effects. So as we all know, we're in a biodiversity crisis. We have the COP15 happening this week in China to try and develop the framework to address this crisis. And we are seeing reports every day on the consequences of this biodiversity crisis. So we know that wild organisms, the abundance of wild organisms has decreased by half over the last 50 years. And there are studies to show in Europe, farmland bird populations have decreased by half in the last couple of decades, and insects have decreased by over 76% in Germany. And we know there are many drivers of biodiversity loss, most of them anthropogenic, And we know that pesticides are one of the key drivers. And this is across both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. The UNEP report that came out this year also identified pollution as the fourth, which includes pesticides, as the fourth biggest driver of terrestrial and marine biodiversity loss, the third biggest driver of freshwater biodiversity loss, and the second biggest driver of insect decline. It is not new knowledge to know that pesticides are a major cause of biodiversity loss. This is something that has been known since the 60s, when, for example, when Rachel Carson brought out her book, Silent Spring, this highlighted the role of pesticide impacts on the environment. And this came about from a number of studies, for example, the identification of DDT as a major cause of bird decline, and this resulted in bans of certain substances, such as DDT, in agriculture. However, pesticide use has continued to increase globally, and there are many highly hazardous pesticides that are highly detrimental to the environment still being used. And unfortunately, some of the harms are still being realized to this day. The other unfortunate thing is it takes years to identify, or after identifying the harms, it takes years for those pesticide residues to be removed from the environment, to break down. So, for example, in Europe, DDT was recently detected in the soils, even though it was banned 36 years before. So we also know that pesticides are designed to kill organisms, so that's not new, but only 0.1% of pesticides actually reach their intended target organism. And that means more than 99% are spreading into the environment, into the land, into the water, and into the air. So first, looking at pesticide effects on land, agriculture, we know, is one of the main areas where pesticides are applied to reduce the pest impact on crops. And unfortunately, there are then consequential negative effects on other organisms in the crops, non-target organisms, and around the crops. And these are often beneficial organisms for agriculture, such as predators, parasites, and infective agents of crop pests and diseases. And by destroying the beneficial insects or organisms, it can also undermine natural pest control. So, for example, by eliminating the natural enemies of pests in the rice or in the crops, can lead to a pest resurgence of the pest species. And this is because natural enemies usually have a slower growth rate and a longer life cycle than the pest species. So the pest species usually recover quicker after a pesticide is applied, and as they recover, there are no natural enemies to keep them under control, and then outbreaks occur. And as well as the effects of pesticides on natural pest regulation, pesticides can also affect other important ecosystem services such as pollination, decomposition of organic material, and bioavailability of plant nutrients. So one of these ecosystems is pollination, and we know now, just through the last few decades, that pesticides have a huge impact on pollinators. And because of this, that we now see bans of many of these pesticides in Europe, and increasingly more in other countries, one of which are the neonicotinoid class of pesticides. These have serious effects on bees and butterflies, for example. These cause direct mortality through exposure, but they also affect their behavior, which affects their ability to survive and reproduce. So this has a negative effect on many fronts. Also, a recent study showed that glyphosate, which is a herbicide, which wasn't expected to have any effect on insects at all, now has been shown to have an effect on the microbiome of bees, which make them more resilient to disease. Pesticides are well known to also have an effect on birds and mammals, and this is mainly because of the effect of biomagnification. Because birds and mammals are usually higher up in the food chain, they consume large amounts of prey that have been contaminated with pesticides, and these persistent pesticides that are contaminated end up building up in their tissues, eventually causing death or other behavioral problems. One example is the effects of rodenticides on raptors and carnivores through secondary poisoning, whereby these predators feed on the carcasses or prey that have been consuming rodenticides. And then there's a classic example from the 60s where we saw population crashes of certain birds of prey in the UK as a result of them feeding on pigeons and other birds, other prey that had been feeding on like pesticide-contaminated foods such as DDT, dieldrin, and aldrin, pesticide-treated seeds. And there are also a few studies, not many, showing how pesticides affect the feeding behavior of birds. There is also a lot of recent literature now showing the effect of pesticides on soil biodiversity. This is sort of relevantly new in terms of a scientific understanding, and the literature now has identified from across 400 studies that pesticides of all types pose a clear risk to soil invertebrates, and this is crucial for an agricultural system where the soil is essential to maintain that sustainability. One example was a study from 2007 where it showed organic chlorine pesticides suppress symbiotic nitrogen fixation, which resulted in lower crop yields, and other more recent studies have shown negative effects on earthworms that are important for nutrient and water cycling. Seed treatments are also highly harmful by exposing soil organisms directly to the pesticides at high doses in the soil, and this is a concern because of the increased use of seed treatments around the world, especially with neonicotinoids, where in the USA we see that almost all non-organic corn is treated with seed-applied fungicides and neonicotinoids, and about 80% of which remain in the soil. And neonicotinoids are especially of concern because of the persistent effects, and they build up over time in the soil. Water, another problem where pesticides are having an impact. Number of studies have now shown high levels of concern of pesticides in water bodies. Even in Europe, where we see quite strict regulation in pesticide use, we're also seeing studies identifying issues of concern. For example, in Germany, a paper came out this year, identified that from 101 agricultural streams that were investigated, 81% had pesticide levels that were above the acceptable levels, and the study concluded that agricultural pesticide pollution was a major driver in reducing aquatic insect populations. In the UK, another recent study identified that fipronil, a pesticide that was banned in agriculture but is still used for flea control for pets, was detected in 98% of samples from 20 English rivers. And these were at levels that were 5 times higher than the safety threshold. Pesticides also have a negative impact on coral reefs and in marine ecosystems as they are washed downstream through rivers and groundwater, and they even get moved around in the ocean, and they've been detected in the Antarctic. Amphibians and fish are especially susceptible. Amphibians especially because they have permeable skin and because their dual aquatic terrestrial life cycle, which exposes them to pesticides on multiple levels. And we see glyphosate, for example, causes high mortality of many species of amphibians. And even sublethal concentrations affect the behavior of aquatic invertebrates. And a recent study identified that pesticides reduced fish and amphibian movement by swim speed by 35% and overall activity by 72%. And there's also mounting evidence showing the effects of pesticides on the endocrine system. So this affects the development, growth, and reproduction of organisms. And this is especially of concern to humans because we share a lot of the same systems as the animals that are being affected in the wild. And there are studies showing how atrazine, a herbicide, has affected amphibians by causing hermaphroditism and demasculinity. And a recent study showed that cane toads exposed to another herbicide in rice called butachlor developed slower and weighed less than the controls. So most examples I shared were direct effects of pesticides. There are also indirect effects, such as one I revealed at the beginning on pest resurgence, but also by reducing the quality and availability of food sources, such as reducing plants through herbicide use or insects through insecticide use. This can reduce or cause declines of other higher order species, such as birds that rely on those insects or other insects that rely on the plants for feeding on. And then there are other interactive effects that we're still learning and understanding, such as one study showed that malathion, an insecticide, led to a decrease in zooplankton diversity that led to an increase in phytoplankton, then a decrease in periphyton, and then finally a decrease in the growth of frog tadpoles. So a very complex relationship that's very difficult to assess in a lab. So this is through scientific studies that eventually revealed this sort of impact. And then there are still further unknown effects that we're still beginning to understand, one of which is gaining a lot of interest is the effects of multiple pesticides on organisms. And one study species is the honeybee, whereby the recent study that was published this year has shown that a cocktail of pesticides, when multiple pesticides are exposed to the honeybee, the effect on the honeybee is significantly greater than if it was just those few pesticides applied separately. They have a synergistic effect whereby they are multiplying each other, causing a much greater impact. And this has also been shown in the bumblebee, and then we are seeing effects of multiple pesticides on soils as well, and there is a need for much more research. And then there are effects of herbicide drift on field margins onto other plants on nearby areas around the fields that are still very little understood. And then there are effects of environment on temperature, for example, on the pesticides that are not commonly assessed in the laboratory when conducting regulatory tests. For example, a study showed that glyphosate, when exposed to common toads at lower temperatures, had a much greater effect on their egg survival than at the normal temperatures where pesticides are evaluated. And then finally, I just want to highlight the effect of toxicity. We know that all pesticides affect organisms at different degrees, and some are more toxic to different non-target species. But often we hear of evidence showing that our pesticides have reduced, the total amount of pesticides is reduced, so therefore the effect on the non-target species is reduced as well. But actually, we're now seeing data showing that even though the pesticide volume may have reduced, the toxicity is generally increasing. So there's a study in the US showing that this is the case, especially against aquatic invertebrates and pollinators. There's also some work from the UK that Pan-UK has been involved in that is showing this trend. And it's quite possibly happening across the world, especially in areas where pesticides are increasing. And this is namely because of the use of more toxic pesticides such as neonicotinoids. And this has important implications for the global framework such as the CBD Global Biodiversity Framework, where their targets are on how to reduce pesticide quantity, and the indicators are of pesticide use per area of cropland, whereas they should also be looking at the toxicity of pesticides being used, reducing more hazardous pesticides from the environment, and setting indicators that are based on toxicity load. So just to wrap up, some of the work Pan-UK is involved in to reduce pesticides involving working with farmers, for example, in Ethiopia, where we are working with partners, Pan-Ethiopia, to help farmers reduce pesticides by moving towards agroecological approaches. And we've had very positive results using a food spray technique, which is involving a brewer's spray that is applied on a brewer's yeast that is applied as a spray on cotton and vegetables, which encourages natural enemies. And this gives the farmers the reassurance that they are encouraging a natural predator of their pest and helps them switch away from pesticide use. We've also recently developed a concept on biodiversity smart villages in Ethiopia, and we're just applying for funding to support this work, where we plan to work with communities to help them understand at a community level the role of biodiversity in agriculture. And then we're also engaged in the CBD process to help encourage the adoption of targets to phase out highly hazardous pesticides and toxic load indicators. And then just on my last slide, these are some of the resources that Pesticides Action Network has developed over the past decade or so to help support pesticide reduction. And I'll just leave that there. One of which, at the bottom, we've been involved in recently is using an app to collect information on acute pesticide poisoning to farmers. So we have a few partners here we're starting to collect information with on that. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex, for this great and very rich talk. Is there any question for Alex? And people who are assisting remotely, of course, you are welcome to write questions in the chat.
Thank you for your talk, Alex. I don't know if we ask question in French or I will ask in English. So my question is about, you mentioned indicators, and you mentioned Rachel Carson and all the history of pesticide. Do we have indication now about a kind of flow of pesticides from one continent to the other? What I mean is that there is no policy for reducing pesticides, mainly in Europe. Does it mean that it's also reducing in Africa or in another country, or it's just the opposite, like a kind of substitution of the use of pesticides from Europe now in Africa? There is some elements for that, but I don't know if you have indication of that.
I see, yeah. Yeah, I don't know the precise answer to that. I know obviously that there is a lot of discussion about pesticides that were banned in Europe but are still being exported to other countries. In terms of has the ban resulted in increased export to other countries or increased use in other countries, yes, I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid, yeah.
Just to just piggybacking on that question, you're aware of the Green Deal, which is being implemented in Europe, and which has consequences on the trade issues, really, with products, product, coffee, cocoa, whatever, comes into Europe. And how do you see the possibility to have easy indicators to facilitate trade? Because Europe will continue to import from a number of countries. For instance, we cannot grow much coffee here. Maybe in Madeira, that's probably the only place close to Europe where we can grow coffee. But how do you see from your work some indicators that could be used, or if there are not any, what sort of research question would you push for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it would be ideal if when we import, there can be policies in place to set limits, or in terms of, we have maximum residue limits already in place like that, but in terms of the pesticides used, that would be good, but I'm not aware of those in place. One area we can also support is the supply chain actors. So I know Pan UK is involved with working with a number of supply chains in the UK, like supermarkets, and also standards like fair trade, to help help them set limits on which pesticides can be used in their supply chain. So a number of them are now adopting lists on which pesticides can be used, which cannot, and which should be phased out gradually over the next few years. So that's another opportunity.
Thank you very much for your speech. I had the following question about the main references you have given about Europe and well, mainly UK, Germany, etc. There are more and more references in this field, in this geographical area, let's say. But do you know? I'm sure there are some, perhaps, studies on more on tropical geographical areas and especially on environmental impacts. Can you perhaps tell us about some data sets or some places where we can find some good information on these precise effects on other areas or regions?
Yeah, I don't know of any clear data set I could point you to, but one of our colleagues from Pan Asia Pacific is actually starting to put together a couple of review papers on the environmental impacts of a few highly hazardous pesticides. And this is using a global set of data, and hopefully that data set will become more widely available, like in a central repository where we can access. But at the moment, there's no easy place to find that data. It's only through literature searches, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, maybe one more question from the chat, and then we'll move to the next speaker. This is an NGO from Colombia. Thanks a lot for your talk. Could you tell us more about your data collection app you have developed? Can we use it? We are interested to use it.
Okay, great. So, yes, so the Pan UK app is a tool to collect information on acute pesticide poisoning. It's a very easy to use app, and at the moment we have it in a few languages, including French, Hindi, and English. So we are interested to develop like a Spanish version, but we haven't done that yet. But it's a very easy to use tool. It takes 15 to 30 minutes to ask a series of questions to farmers, and we ask them about what crops they're growing, what pesticides have they used, and what effects that had on their body if they had acute symptoms of poisoning 24 hours after they used a pesticide. We are happy to discuss using it anywhere. We're happy to share the app. Just the challenge is the resource to apply it and interview the farmers. But yep, just drop me a line.